Hello, welcome back to the Brendan O'Neill Show with me, Brendan O'Neill, and my special guest this week, Jonathan Sacerdoti. Jonathan, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you on. As you know, I've been a keen follower of your writing for some time. Your writing on Israel, in particular, in The Spectator and elsewhere. Everyone should read it if they're not reading it already. And there's a lot for us to talk about on this topic matter this week. The week that we're speaking, a lot is happening. And I guess let's kick off with talking about the conflict itself, because it has restarted. Israel has broken the ceasefire. That's what the headlines are saying, and has restarted its military crusade against Hamas in Gaza, and it's kicking off and everyone's talking about it. So let's start just by asking you, what did you think about that when that happened? Were you surprised? Did you see this coming? How do you feel about the resumption of those hostilities?
Well, Israel had found itself, I think, trapped in an untenable situation because over recent weeks, there was no active combat. It had largely ceased. And Hamas was regrouping and strengthening its position. But at the same time, there weren't any hostages being released anymore because phase one of the agreement they'd made had come to an end. And so I think that made things very difficult for Israel. Humanitarian aid that was originally intended for the citizens of Gaza was effectively once again being translated into effectively funds flowing directly into Hamas's coffers because they predominantly take control of the aid and then sell it to the Gazan people. And that in turn funds their war machine. And I think that at the same time, with no hostages coming back into Israel, there was a sort of stalemate for Israel. And that increasingly concerned both the Israelis, or many of them, and the new US administration, because Hamas appeared to be very comfortable with that position. And they think, I guess, that Israel would hesitate to resume military operations. So I think in terms of that, Hamas had made this miscalculation that the internal political disputes within Israel would stop decisive action. And also, I think they perhaps interpreted the US diplomatic engagement with them. So the US had sent their special presidential envoy for hostage affairs, Adam Boehler, to actually negotiate directly with Hamas, something the US doesn't normally do. And I think that they saw that as a sign of America's willingness to tolerate the Hamas presence. And so everything seemed to be good for them. So in effect, all of that added up to Israel deciding on this surprise, or maybe not so surprising, resumption of fighting. Perhaps the timing was more surprising for some, and it was a strategic decision. And indeed, Israel took out quite a few senior leaders of Hamas in that first night of airstrikes, which I think I saw you wrote. Very few of the reports actually bothered to comment on that here in the UK and around the world. They just sort of concentrated on this high but possibly made up number of Palestinian civilian casualties.
Yeah, that's a very good outline of, I think, where we're at generally, not only with this resumption of the conflict, but also how things stand really between Hamas in America, Hamas in Israel, and what's going on. The way I see the breakdown of the ceasefire is, I just see it as being entirely Hamas's responsibility, because what has become clear over the past few weeks is that Hamas has been using this moment to, firstly, to taunt the Jewish state and to taunt Jews. Its handover of hostages have become the most grotesque anti-Semitic spectacles, and they use them as political stunts in order to morally and psychologically wound Israel, if not militarily wound it. At the same time, they've clearly been using this, as you say, to gather together the aid, to boost their coffers and to increase their funding, and also to regroup and rearm. And so it's their fault, isn't it, that this has fallen down, because they haven't been, as you say, they haven't been serious partners in peace. And doesn't it raise the broader question, which so few people want to talk about, which is, why should Israel have to live next door to such an existential enemy as that?
Well, I think everything you've said is correct. In a way, I don't really care for discussions of whose fault it is the fighting's resumed, or whether Israel broke the ceasefire or Hamas did, because, ceasefires are only really worth the paper they're written on if it's working, and it wasn't working. What was working for Israel was not anything except for the fact that they were getting hostages back. At the end of the day, that's the central feature, the central fact that one has to remember here. Just, hundreds of people taken from their homes or from a party or also from military bases, kept in horrific conditions in the Gaza Strip, deliberately tortured, starved, killed. So I think that given that that's the basis upon which Israel made any kind of agreement with Hamas, as soon as that dried up, as soon as those hostages aren't being released anymore, not even dead ones, why on earth would Israel keep to the ceasefire? I certainly don't blame them, even if we want to say they broke the ceasefire. But as you said, I think we can say that if we're looking at the letter of the law, Hamas broke the ceasefire many times over in the period that it was still holding. For example, when they sent back a random Palestinian corpse instead of an Israeli woman's body. So I think there are plenty of moments that we could point to. And I'd also say that other things have changed, which is, very important to note. The new US administration has explicitly supported Israel's efforts to weaken Hamas. And that's quite a difference from how things were before under Joe Biden. And Israel also has a newly appointed chief of staff of the Israeli Defense Forces, Eyal Zamir, who advocates a much more aggressive strategy too. And that includes ground invasion and even a sustained occupation in Gaza. And so I think he believes that the previous tactics of sort of brief incursions into Gaza with rapid withdrawals has proven really to be ineffective in dismantling Hamas. And I think we can all agree that, Israel has spent 17, 18 months fighting. It should have been able to destroy Hamas, many have said, though obviously there are complicating factors. So I think that perhaps his new strategy would also play quite a part. And also, add to that there's a substantial military aid now from the United States. All of the blockages that the Biden administration would periodically put on shipment of weapons and ammunition, all gone. Trump has said, have what you need. He's sent it. He hasn't just said it. The Trump administration, as soon as it assumed office, has provided Israel with greater operational flexibility and enabled much more sustained and robust military activity. So I think all of that has come together now. And that's why I think that what we're seeing is unlikely to be, a short, sharp shock. There is one way in which it might be, which is if Israel can use this to force Hamas back to negotiations quickly. And there are now some Hamas representatives being summoned for more negotiations, I think in Egypt. So if that's possible, there may be a pause to try and get more hostages out, but Israel will be specific that it wants that to be on the Witkoff plan, not on the original terms where there was going to be a stage 2 and it would effectively end the war on Israel's part. No, I think now they're looking possibly at a small number of living hostages and a small number of dead hostages to be released. But other than that, I think Israel's going back in much more seriously now.
Yeah, it does look that way. You mentioned there that something I wrote about this week is on what this, and you mentioned it in your piece for The Spectator too, the impact that this the latest Israeli attacks have had. And of course, the media coverage is all about Israel's genocidal lunacy and it's killing civilians. And that's all it wants to do. It just wants to kill women and children, etc. That's what we hear all the time. And yet, actually, these latest attacks have been very successful in war terms. And they've taken out leading Hamas commanders, including the de facto Hamas prime minister of Gaza and one of its chief security officials and a leader of Palestinian Islamic Jihad. I mean, very very high players in the war against the Jewish state. We don't hear about that very often. It's not talked about. What have you made of the media coverage? I mean, it is par for the course, I guess, because we're used to this now. But over the past few days, since the resumption of the conflict, what have you made of the coverage of it?
I think it's been more of the same, but just worse, I would say. And I am, I suppose, naive to be surprised by it ever, because it's been my whole life that it's been this way. But during this war, it's got worse and worse and worse. I think they've sort of dropped any pretense of reporting things as they are. I mean, I don't mean to make light of what they are reporting. War is really horrible, and there are people who are suffering enormously in Gaza, and that is part of the tragedy of the Hamas rule there, that those people are being deliberately kept in the way of the Israeli military activity, and they're being deliberately used. That is something I think Israel acknowledges very openly, and it's also been something that's held back its military capability at many points, because they could have done much more if they didn't care at all about Palestinian civilians. And you know, all the discussions about how complicit Palestinian civilians are in the overall Palestinian invasion on October the 7th, and all of those things aside, of course, there are always in every war people who get caught up in the horrors, and there's no denying that. And I wouldn't want to deny that. I think all of us would love to see an end to war, an end to killing, an end to innocents being caught up in wars. Unfortunately, that concern can never be something that just ends wars when they are being fought on existential and really moral and ethical duties. And Israel's moral and ethical duty is to defend itself, but more than that, yes, to go on the offensive and get rid of the people on its borders who don't just pose a threat, they burst over the borders and invaded and burnt and pillaged and raped and stole and took hostages. I mean, everything you could possibly think of, they did it. I walked through the burnt out homes in the kibbutzim, like many who went and visited in the months after October the 7th. I saw the damage. It wasn't a sort of casual demonstration of wanting some kind of romantic return to some mythical homeland. They used thermobaric weapons inside people's homes. If you can imagine marauding terrorists bursting into your home, burning the place at such high temperature with specific weapons that it could take something like 11 weeks to identify a body from DNA. That's the sort of damage that they did. And I think that given that that's the case, there's an absolute responsibility on Israel to make sure that that shouldn't be able to happen again. And yet, earlier on, you said something about, the dealing with the problem of that sort of threat on the borders. Israel will never get rid of that sort of threat on its borders, actually. I think that's clear because the Middle East is full of countries and forces that aren't necessarily even state actors who despise Jews, despise everything that Israel stands for, even aside from being a Jewish state. Its liberal values, its women's rights, its gay rights, its freedoms in every respect, even its freedoms for Arabs and Muslims. Probably the place where female Arab Muslims are freest in the Middle East is Israel. The only place in the Middle East, I said this in many public speeches, often to students, the only place in the Middle East where Jews and Arabs live together in any number in some form of coexistence and collaboration is Israel. These things are extraordinary about that country, but they're also what makes jihadi forces all over the region absolutely hate the country. And those forces will never go away. The Middle East is predominantly Muslim. It's got an extraordinary number of states which are aggressively jihadi, either in terms of the administrations that run them or in terms of very large groups that operate within them. And so Israel's best hope is to make some form of peace with neighbors, as it has done many times in its history, where even if it's a cold peace, it's better than being invaded and having literally active aggression on your borders. And where it can't do that, it needs to do the rest through absolute strength and force, so that those who won't make peace understand that if they make war, the consequences are going to be colossal, enormous, and as definitive as possible on Israel's part. And I think that's what we're seeing in Gaza. I think we still have, despite everything over the last 18 months, and never mind that, over the last 70-something years, we still have the Palestinian cause, the Palestinian identity, defined almost entirely, even on the so-called moderate side, as the end of, the eradication of, the wiping out of Israel. And as long as that's the case, there is literally no way in which Israel can make any other kind of peace with the Palestinians, even if there are portions of its own society that wants to try and do so. It's not going to happen.
This episode of The Brendan O'Neill Show is brought to you by Shopify. Have you ever had an idea for a business, but you just don't know where to start? Whether it's a passion project or a side hustle, getting started can feel overwhelming. But with Shopify, turning that idea into reality is easier than you think. That's the sound of another sale on Shopify, the all-in-one commerce platform that's powering millions of businesses worldwide. Whether you're selling dog coats or vintage totes, Shopify makes it easy to build, customize, and grow your online shop, no matter what your skill level is. What's great about Shopify is that it grows with you. You can customize your shop to match your brand, connect with new customers, and keep them coming back. It can even get you started selling across social media marketplaces like TikTok, Facebook, and Instagram. And once the sales start rolling in, Shopify makes getting paid simple by accepting all payment types instantly. But it doesn't stop there. Shopify takes the guesswork out of marketing with built-in tools that help you create, execute, and analyze your campaigns. And with its easy-to-use central dashboard, you can manage orders, shipping, and payments from anywhere in the world. If you're ready to make your business dreams a reality, it's time to start using Shopify. Sign up for a £1 per month trial period at shopify.co.uk/Brendan, all lowercase. Go to shopify.co.uk/Brendan to take your business to the next level today. That's shopify.co.uk/Brendan. Yeah, how do you even start? If that's the basis of the other side, that they want to destroy your entire nation, your entire homeland, there's no starting point there. Okay, you mentioned there some of the things Hamas did on 7th of October 2023, the burning, the assaulting, the violence, and so on. So it's a horrible topic, of course, and many listeners know the details already, but let's talk a bit about that, because the other thing that happened this week is that the 7th of October Parliamentary Commission report came out, overseen by Lord Roberts, the historian. You've written about it for The Spectator this week. I've written about it on Spiked, and it's an extraordinary document. It's more than 300 pages, and it details everything that happened, what it entailed, what it involved, who was involved, and so on. And even though many of us know the details and know the numbers and so on, it is still extraordinary to see it laid out in such forensic detail. And I think it's a horrible and essential report. You've read it, obviously, you've written about it. What were your thoughts when you read it? Was there anything in it that you didn't know previously? How did you find the experience of reading this account of that day?
It's interesting because your question there, was there anything in it that I didn't know? It reminds me of how I've always felt about the Holocaust, which is even growing up as the son of a Holocaust survivor, even growing up as a Jewish person in the late 20th, early 21st century, I've always said that with the Holocaust, there will always be things you didn't know about it. You could spend your whole life studying it, and there will always be elements you just didn't know. Whether it's micro elements or much larger ones. And I think there's been a lot of comparison with the Holocaust since October the 7th, and there are, of course, many differences. But I will say that that's one of the similarities, because no matter how many times I read stories from October the 7th and afterwards, there are moments where I just think, oh, I didn't know that, or that's an interesting feature, I haven't heard that person's story. And once something is an atrocity on a scale of like this one, I think there are always going to be elements you don't know. So there were bits that I read in there. And I will say that it's also, I thought it was a really brilliant document because it's very, very clear. It's very, very nicely laid out. It's clear with graphics, with graphs, with information, as well as a very clearly expressed narrative that explains everything. And it's also the other thing that I think Andrew Roberts and the committee have done is they've been very specific in only documenting things that they say they could absolutely corroborate. If there were things where they felt that they did know them and they looked highly likely, but they couldn't solidly corroborate it, they even left those out. And I think that's very important because he said that the aim of this document is to be an almost real-time antidote to the sad and sick phenomenon of denial that we saw during and after the Holocaust, and then we saw immediately on October the 7th, literally on October the 7th and in the subsequent days. So given that that's a feature of modern analysis of atrocities going on, especially when they involve Israel and Jews, but not exclusively, I think it's really important that there are people who say, no, we're going to do our best to counter that from the word go. It won't stop it, it won't kill it off. But it does a good job. And I said in that article, and I even, in conversations actually this morning, correspondence with Andrew Roberts, I said, I really hope you will send this, not just publish it. I hope you'll send it to schools. Every school in the country should get it. Every mosque in the country could be sent it. Every church, every synagogue everyone should read this report or scan through it or look at it, because there's so much to see and learn in there. And just like the Holocaust, I think we all have a bit of an obligation these days. So I got a lot of questioning from friends and family, because from the word go, I watched as many horrible videos as I could from October the 7th. On the day I was watching them as they were coming live onto the internet. And I searched these things out, and okay, I understand, I'm a journalist, I may be more inclined to do that than most people, but I actually think that if one can stomach these things without it destroying something special about humanity inside you, and I appreciate not everyone can, I think we have to. I don't think any of us gets to choose the era that we're born into. And we are living through an era of alarming and horrific evil in some places. And we can only ever hope to fight that if we understand it. And we can only ever hope to understand it if we expose ourselves to it. Part of the problem that I think this document from the All-Party Parliamentary Group, UK-Israel Parliamentary Group, is going to counter is not necessarily just the deniers, but the people who don't want to know because it's so horrible, and they sort of protect themselves and cocoon themselves from it and say, I refuse to read it, I refuse to believe it, because it injures my sense of what humanity is. Tough. That sense of humanity is wrong, and if you value what you love in life, you need to stand up for it, and you can only stand up for it if you expose yourself to the very worst of the people trying to take it away from you.
Yeah, it's one of the points I make in my piece about it is that, you know, we have a moral duty to know the truth about 7th of October and to tell the truth about 7th of October. So those of us who do know it and have read the document and, like you, have watched the films and written about it over the past 16, 17 months, we do have a responsibility to communicate that to as many people as possible so that the truth cannot be buried underneath the denialism that we've seen rising over the past few months. I did want to ask you about one part of the report in particular, because I think one myth that it really shatters is the idea that what happened on 7th of October was kind of a breakout of Gaza. It was a spontaneous act of violence. It was the wretched of the earth kind of freeing themselves from their prison camp and just wreaking this desperate, despairing vengeance on their oppressors. I mean, that's the story we've been told. And I have to say that even though I don't agree with any of these people in what they're saying, I have occasionally fallen for this idea that it might at least have been a spontaneous act. I've said from the very beginning it was a pogrom, it was an act of evil. It's one that Israel has every right to fight back against and, in my view, to eliminate the movement responsible for it. But even I possibly found myself getting sucked into the idea that it was quite spontaneous. It was just, you know, let's go and get them. That's not the case at all. And I noticed that that's one thing that struck me about the report. And I noticed that you mentioned it in the piece that you wrote about it as well. This was a very conscious and well-organized act of fascist violence, wasn't it?
Absolutely. And the report does a great job of documenting that as well. I think one of the big shocks for Israel was actually that there turned out to have been quite a lot of intelligence within the Israeli machine about this. And we still don't really understand what went wrong. But what seems most likely to have gone wrong is that there was just not enough joined up thinking. So Israel actually knew a lot about this planning and training that had been going on in the Gaza Strip in the years before this attack. And yet there was a sort of assumption that it just could never happen, that it was a sort of fantasy that they were maybe even preparing for, but it just wasn't possible for it to happen because Israel had become complacent in its own military and intelligence superiority. Well, obviously that was shattered. And in this document, it shows that the preparation for the attacks involved extensive training. They had drills, storming mock Israeli communities, breaching defenses. They rehearsed hostage taking. They had all manner of preparations for what they did. They came prepared with the required weapons. I mentioned, the thermobaric weaponry. This is real weapons of war used in ordinary people's homes early in the morning, for example. And none of that can have been accidental when there was actually video evidence of them training available online. You and I could have found it in the years running up to the actual event. It's very clear that this was not in any way a spontaneous anything. It was a carefully calculated, very, very effectively carried out brutal and military-style invasion of Israel. And yes, the document makes that clear as well. That's why I think it's such a good document. I must say, I really do take my hat off to them for the job they've done, because it seems weird for any UK parliamentary group to be making this document in one respect. Like, why on earth is our parliament doing that? But on the other hand, great, it's doing that because we're a country that's meant to stand up against this kind of barbarity and evil. And unfortunately, we have a government at the moment that isn't doing that. It's actually confused within itself over whether or not what Israel is doing is even legal. We had David Lammy, saying that it was Israel was breaking international humanitarian law, and then having to sort of try and read it back, and the Foreign Office sort of contradicting him, and Keir Starmer sort of contradicting him. I think he actually seemed to have bounced himself into that position accidentally or out of stupidity. Or maybe it wasn't out of stupidity. Maybe he wanted to make such a mistake because he wanted it out there. I don't really know what's going on with this government. And so, again, all the more important that this parliamentary group has actually at least shown a degree of moral fortitude and being just decent people based purely on facts and figures that they can prove and show. I think it's so, so important.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Another thing that struck me reading the document, which is something that I've thought about a lot over the past year and a half, and I know you have too, is this question of moral equivalence. And it drives me round the twist when I see people making a moral equivalence between what Hamas did on 7th of October and then how Israel has responded to it. And I completely agree with the point you made earlier about the enormous suffering in Gaza, and a lot of people there are suffering. And that's one of the reasons some of us hate Hamas, not only because it inflicts barbarism on Israelis, but also because it condemns so many Palestinians to misery, hunger, and war by elevating its obsessive hatred of Jews above everything else. So Hamas condemns both sides to this kind of cycle of misery. But the idea that there is a comparison between the events of 7th of October, which are laid out in such meticulous detail in this report, and are just eye-wateringly remarkable in their barbarism. The idea that there is a connection, there is an equivalence between them and then Israel's military response. I mean, that is just complete nonsense, isn't it? But this, and you know that, but this report really brings that home very clearly.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, even the worst of the features of a war, especially in relation to civilians, is obviously completely different if that war is being carried out by a state actor that does make efforts to spare civilians suffering and death. It's not succeeding in doing that, absolutely, just as any war and any army won't succeed in doing that. It's impossible to do it. But of course, I think only an idiot would try and make an equivalence between a war where there is an army making efforts to do that and an invasion where barbaric terrorists literally explained what they were doing while they were doing it and before they were doing it and after they were doing it, where they actively said that they were trying to kill Jews or that they were targeting people for being Jews. It's in Hamas's founding charter. And even if it weren't, it's in the very DNA of the organization from its earliest origins as the Mujama al-Islamiyah in Gaza before it officially became Hamas, the armed wing of it in 1987. From before that, when in its early roots in the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, and when that was outlawed in Egypt, it then found this fertile ground in Gaza to keep going. All of these organizations, as well as being linked through a historical narrative, have in common their jihadi psychopathy. They are aimed at carrying out jihad, at creating a broader Islamic pan-national, not even pan-national, it's an ummah, it's a worldwide conquering that involves killing Jews, that involves conquering land. So given that that's the ethos, and that's why it's so weird to have seen events like that one at the LSE with this book that tries to whitewash Hamas as somehow having had early roots in being a little bit anti-Jewish, but now it's a sort of, powerful political force for Palestinian self-determination. It's nonsense, because if you actually study in any sense the history and current day ethos of that organization. And not just that organization, even Fatah and the Palestinian Authority have deeply problematic religious references and ideologies and thought patterns within them. So even if they're not meant to be the Islamic expression of Palestinian nationalism, they still reward people for being martyrs, which is an Islamic concept of killing Jews and others through terror acts and killing yourself in the process. It makes you a martyr. So these sorts of things, I think, make it very clear that there is literally no equivalence. Even if you hate Israel, and even if you think it has a lousy army that operates on substandard moral and ethical codes, the fact that it is a democratic country, that it has an army that is operating according to moral and ethical codes and interpretations of international law, we can all argue over whether it gets that right or not, but it just means they're not even in the same ballpark.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit about the kind of people, and there are an awful number, high number of them, who make these kind of moral equivalences. And we're really talking about, most of the left, the activist class, a lot of the media, a lot of the liberal media, even if they don't outright say it, it's the undertone of so much of their coverage of the conflict that, Hamas might be bad, but Israel, if anything, is even worse. That is the continual undertone or overtone we get all the time. So let's talk a bit about kind of left-wing activists, that kind of noisy section of society, and how they responded to 7th of October and what they've been doing over the past year and a half. You made the point in your piece about this report, about this parliamentary report, you made the point that no one can now deny what happened on 7th of October. Here it is in black and white, laid out in calm, meticulous detail. But I think you probably also know that people still will deny it. There are still going to be people who say they'll either outright deny it and say it's exaggerated, or most people were killed by the IDF on that day, etc., or they'll deny it in an underhand, kind of a immoral way by saying, well, Israel brought it on itself. It's Israel's fault that this happened. What did you make of that response to 7th of October? You said earlier that, Holocaust denial actually took some time to come to the surface of society. It really didn't take off until the 60s and the 70s, quite some time after the events themselves. 7th of October denialism was almost instantaneous. Straight away, we were being told women were not raped, that many people were not killed. Israel did the killing, not Hamas. What did you make of that response? Were you shocked by that? And do you think this report will help to counter some of that?
Well, I hate to be that guy, but I wasn't shocked in the least bit, because I've watched it happening every single time there's been any kind of engagement in Gaza or any kind of military reaction by Israel to the Palestinians, and I've watched it get worse each time. So it was completely predictable that this would happen. I wasn't even surprised that it happened on the day. I just wasn't. I could have almost written the blueprint for how they reacted. That doesn't make me feel great to say that. I don't pat myself on the back for being some kind of, psychic. It's not. I just had my eyes open to it for many years. And this is an area that I've, like you, have followed and talked about and been sort of really in the middle of. So I think that was the case. And I think, again, the fact that it has become a sort of left-wing issue is so strange to me, because left and right don't really mean anything anymore when you think about it. There's nothing left-wing about standing up for a fanatical Islamic outlook on the world. There is nothing left-wing about that. Like, if you stripped out all the words and the actual peoples and countries you're talking about, and you just put the ethos to people on the left, of course they're not in favor of a group that tortures or kidnaps babies or throws gay people off tall buildings or does any of the things that Hamas and other Palestinian terrorist groups do. And yet, in this context, we can see very clearly that they've aligned themselves with it. And when they say things like, you mentioned, Israel brought it upon itself, the idea that you could do anything as a state that brings upon yourself what happened on October the 7th, again, that's not left-wing, it's not logical, it's not humane to believe that. If I can't think of anything that would justify kidnapping babies or old women or keeping hostages and starving them deliberately and torturing them constantly. I just can't think of anything that would justify that in my mind. So the idea that you could think that and then not think, well, in that case, Hamas has brought upon itself Israel's response. It's even internally inconsistent as a sort of logical chain of thought. So I think that they must know deep inside themselves, they really must know that this is not a logical position they're taking or an ethical or moral one. And if it's not that, then I do wonder why they can't just look inwards in a quiet moment. They don't need to do it for you and me and just say, maybe I've got this wrong. Maybe I just actually don't like Jews very much. And maybe I should interrogate that opinion within myself and try to see if it's okay or if I should change it. And if I should change it, how I should. That's all I'm asking people to do. I know not everyone's going to agree with me on all this stuff. I really do. And I've never been bombastic about it that I think, everyone must bow to my opinion. But I expressed my opinion clearly and tried to reason it and do it logically, as you do. And I think that my only hope is that documents like that one, the all-party parliamentary group, and even the things that I write and the broadcasts I do and things like this interview, just that someone listening goes to themselves and thinks, I haven't thought about it like that. Let's just look at it closely and reads a bit more. And I'll tell you what, they do, because I get emails and comments every single day from people all around the world. It's quite gratifying, even just one or two that say, I'm not Jewish, not Christian, not Muslim. I'm 60 years old, 40 years old, 20 years old. I hadn't thought about this before. I got one from a guy today, a New Zealand atheist in his 60s, who told me he was appalled by everything he's seeing. And he's got up and traveled to Israel and is volunteering in Beersheba in Israel at the moment to try and understand things better. And I thought, wow, that's extraordinary that there are people in the world who are actually just much quieter than the mobs that take to our streets and try to bully us. And I think the last thing I'll say about that is the mobs are doing that because they know they aren't the majority. And I think the reason they behave that way is they want to bully and pressure everyone into agreeing with them. And I think that is utterly reprehensible. And I think the worst part of that is when you see governments bowing to them because they are not the majority. Most people don't agree with them. If they did, they wouldn't need to go and do that stuff.
Hi, it's Brendan here. I want to let you know some exciting news. My new book is out now. It's called After the Pogrom, 7th of October, Israel and the Crisis of Civilization. And it's available right now from Amazon. I'm really proud of this book. It is an unflinching account of how the West failed the moral test of 7th of October 2023, which of course is the day that Hamas and other militants invaded Israel and unleashed barbarism. The book documents in chilling detail how activists, academics, and others in the West ended up making excuses for Hamas's violence, ended up taking the side of the pogromists against the pogrom's victims, and ended up, in the process, turning their backs on the values of civilization. The book is fundamentally a call to arms for Western civilization. It makes the case for restoring Enlightenment values and standing with Israel while it's under attack by radical Islamists. I don't know if an author is allowed to describe his own book as essential reading, but I really do think it's essential reading. It's called After the Pogrom, 7th of October, Israel and the Crisis of Civilization, and you can get your copy right now on Amazon. Yeah, it is incredibly gratifying when you get those kinds of responses from people. And I've had some of those since 7th of October in response to my book and in response to the things I've been writing, just people saying, people for whom it was a bit of a turning point. I mean, this is something that this is an issue you and I have been writing about for some time, but I think for a lot of people, 7th of October was a real wake-up call. Not for enough people, in my view, but certainly for a significant number. Let's talk a little bit about those mobs. And I think you're right. They do not represent the majority, which is one of the reasons they have to stomp around and scream at the top of their lungs. And it's kind of like this wokist jihadist alliance. And I really agree with you that it's completely surreal to me how it's come to be left-wing, supposedly, to take the side of religious hysterics, kind of medieval armies who are homophobic, misogynistic, and so on. It's incredible to me, but that is what's happened. And we've seen marches since 7th of October in London, in New York, in Berlin, at which people have either been outright pro-Hamas or certainly very, very unfairly anti-Israel. What's your impression of where that kind of stuff now stands? Because the more optimistic side of me feels that it might be dwindling a little bit, maybe possibly running out of steam, certainly not as intense as it was in the days and weeks after 7th of October, although we shouldn't forget what happened. Where do you think that kind of hysterical response from the left-wing cliques in the West, where do you think that stands now?
I'm not sure how to measure whether it's got worse or better, and I'm not optimistic about it. That's I suppose the headline here. And I'll tell you why, because it's not even the hysteria or the mobs or the protesters that bothers me the most, though they do bother me a lot. It's actually the wider kind of climate, the broader climate around them. And I think that part of the reason that they felt so emboldened to behave the way they have is that nobody's really stopping them properly, certainly not at high level. They've been allowed to do this week after week after week after week, and it's allowed to be violent and obnoxious and threatening and bullying week after week after week. So there have been a few moments where it looked like there might be some reaction to it, but there's been no bold, after the Southport killings, the government and the police made it really, really clear that that wouldn't be permitted. And no similar thing happened in relation to this. So I think that's what distresses me. And I don't know if you saw that story as well that I wrote about the Israeli guy who got kidnapped by 3 Muslims and they lured him into this cottage they'd rented in Wales and tried to tie him to a radiator. I mean, they sounded like the 3 morons from that film, 3 Lions. And thank goodness for him. I actually met him yesterday, had a coffee with him, because I just wanted to talk with the guy that had been through all that. And that stuff also bothers me because it got so little coverage. I mean, it's getting a bit more now. And I appreciate that during the time when it was a live court case, it couldn't be covered that much. But the second it was revealed that there was a judgment, they were found guilty, they were put in prison, I couldn't understand how that wasn't, honestly, front page news across most of the media. And it wasn't, and it still isn't. That's the stuff that worries me. A Jewish man, even an Israeli Jewish man, got kidnapped, and people sort of treated it like it wasn't anything really that remarkable. It's extraordinarily remarkable. And as I wrote in that piece in The Spectator, it reminded me of the story of Ilan Halimi, who is a French Jewish guy who got kidnapped at the age of 23 many years ago. He ended up being kidnapped. They tried to get money out of his family, who didn't really have any. And then after 20-something days of torturing him, they dumped him by a roadside, and he was found and died on his way to the hospital. Now, Itai Kashti, thank God, didn't have that, because he managed to escape from the guys himself and managed to alert his wife and the police. But God forbid the guy would have ended up being kept there and they tried to get money out of him and his family and what have you. I don't like to think how it would have gone. Those things really worry me. And I think there's just been a string of them. I mean, any given week, you could literally trot out a string of such stories or incidents that just give an idea of the climate that is horribly, horribly wrong. And anyone looking at it ought to be able to just take a step back and go, this is so wrong. We're getting this so wrong. We need to fix it. And I don't see it happening. I don't see any, I mean, I do see it a bit in the States with Trump now, that there are, I mean, the protests, the fact that they're arresting people who are on visas or green cards in the US, but have been for months causing trouble and disruptions and protesting in favor of Hamas and terrorism. It's so logical that there should be consequences for that sort of behavior. And yet it's controversial that that's happening. Here, nobody's even trying to remedy the problem. So I'm not optimistic at all. Even if they get a bit quieter in some ways, I don't think any of it's going in the right direction, sadly.
Yeah, Tom Slater wrote an excellent piece for Spiked about the kidnapping of the Jewish Israeli guy by those 3 men, and making that point that, why is this not a bigger story? This was an attempt to bring the spirit of 7th of October to the United Kingdom and to inflict pain and suffering on a man, primarily because he's a Jewish man. I mean, it is an extraordinary story. And you think to yourself, or at least you hope, that in a different era, it would be very widely talked about. Or if it happened to a member of a different ethnic minority, you think it would be widely talked about. But in this case, it just wasn't. It was extraordinary. I think that's a point very powerfully made, that even though the fury on the streets might ebb and flow and go up and down, that kind of reluctance more broadly to talk about the seriousness of the anti-Semitism problem we face, that's a real worry. And on that, I did want to ask you about the blind spot on anti-Semitism. David Baddiel's written about this. I know you've written about it over the years. And it's not just a blind spot amongst the left, which claims to be anti-racist, but then turns away whenever Jews are attacked. But it's a blind spot in respectable society, I think, where they, the fashionable thing now is to be ostentatiously anti-racist and to see racism everywhere, even where it doesn't exist, but not to talk or comment on the surge in anti-Semitism that we've seen across Europe since 7th of October. What do you think explains that blind spot?
I wish I knew that, and I do get asked an awful lot in my my events and articles and talks. What's causing anti-Semitism? It's really hard for me to understand it because it just seems so illogical. Even if you don't have particular love for Jews, in fact, why should anyone particularly? But just totally illogical. I consider it a bit like a mental illness, but that doesn't help explain it. And what I'm going to say is perhaps just to slightly shift the focus, which is at the same time as that complete disregard or lack of interest in Jews being increasingly sidelined or persecuted or abandoned, there is something going on as well, which is worrying because it's in combination with that. And that is, I would say, the kind of normalization of Islam in our society. And it makes me even a little uncomfortable still to bring it up because it is something that's controversial. But I think that's why I feel the need to bring it up. When we see things like The Archers on Radio 4 having this storyline, this everyday story of country folk in this quintessentially British place, Ambridge doesn't exist, but we all know The Archers as something very British. And then there's a storyline where one of the characters is fasting for Ramadan because she wants to expand the human experience and what have you. There's nothing inherently wrong with these things. Or when we see this video come out of Windsor Castle, where they were invited to have an iftar meal, breaking a Ramadan fast, and we heard the sort of prayer echo through the hall of Allahu Akbar. Those things do, I think, jar for a lot of people. And it's not because they're racist or because they hate Muslims. It's because they're going on at the same time as things like this abandonment of Jews who are going through this very real sense of crisis, a justified sense of crisis, and a sense of crisis that is often brought on by the actions of some people who commit acts in the name of Islam. Given that that's the case, it's the two things happening in tandem. I mean, I saw this BBC Leicester report this morning of the first ever iftar in the streets of Leicester, and they've laid out all their food across the whole of the middle of a road. And again, it made me wonder. I went in Oxford Street and joined Chabad, which is a sort of joyous Jewish outreach organization, as they lit a Hanukkah during Hanukkah on Oxford Street. And I thought, well, isn't it just the same that they're having iftar in the streets of Leicester and we lit Hanukkah candles on the streets of London? But in a way, it's not just the same, actually. And I think that it's very uncomfortable for all of us to talk about it, but I'm all for uncomfortable conversations. And there may be things that I'm getting wrong here and that somebody can explain to me why I'm wrong. And I'm more than willing to listen and take that on board. But I think that those things are all happening together, and that all the shifts we're experiencing as Jews and as non-Jews and as Muslims and non-Muslims are giving a very clear message over what's on the up, what's on the decline, what's tolerable, what's intolerable, who gets to speak up and say, what about our concerns, and who just doesn't. And I think more and more Jews are getting the sense that our concerns aren't important enough. And that is sadly at exactly the same time as we're feeling those concerns are more and more urgent. So I think that the overall picture, it's really hard to paint it precisely when you're in it, but I think it's really distressing. And I think about it all day, every day. And it makes me really worried, not just for me as a Jewish person, but I think for Britain and for us as Westerners and people who should be valuing all the freedoms and privileges that we've grown up with and just took for granted. And I just think we're not thinking about those things enough, to defend them enough, and to make sure we're getting the balance right all the time. It's sort of happening accidentally.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons many people feel uncomfortable with these very overt displays of Islamic belief or Islamic culture. I mean, one reason is because, we live in a secular society with Christian foundations, so it just jars with people. You don't expect to see overt religiosity in the streets or whatever. So it can make people feel uncomfortable, and I agree with you. It doesn't mean they're racist. It just means they're not sure why this is happening. But I think another reason it makes people feel uncomfortable is because they're continually told that not only is it fine that all this is happening, but they are not allowed to make any critical comments about it at all. And I did want to ask you about the idea of Islamophobia in relation to all of this. And one of the Labour government's current tasks is to work out a definition of Islamophobia or another definition of Islamophobia, which might then become a tool used by local councils, public bodies, and so on to define what is Islamophobia and what isn't. Now, I happen to believe that anti-Muslim bigotry is a real thing, and we often see it. We see it online. We see it in the way in which some people express themselves and the behaviors that they carry out. And obviously, everyone has a responsibility to call out anti-Muslim bigotry just as they would any other form of bigotry. But the idea of Islamophobia is something very different in my mind, and it is quite a censorious idea. What have you made of the recent discussions, I guess especially since Labour took control, of the idea of Islamophobia and this obsession with it amongst the kind of ruling classes?
I think one of the first things to note about these public displays as well is that Islam is a proselytizing religion and Judaism isn't. For example, Jews actually actively don't want converts. It's extremely difficult to convert to Judaism, and the obligation on rabbis and people is to try to turn away converts. And Islam, just by its basic principles, would welcome converts to Islam. So I think that some people do feel more threatened by overt expressions of Islamic practice in public in a country that, as you say, has Christian foundations and also is generally not one where we do overt religion very often in public places. So given that that's the case, I think that's also worthy of some examination in how we feel about these things. And that doesn't mean that I believe every expression of people's Islamic faith in public is necessarily an attempt to convert us or conquer us. I don't think that. That's just an area that I think is worth looking at. And in terms of Islamophobia, I do think it's a really tricky discussion, again, because we've, as Jews, and we've spoken a lot about anti-Semitism. And again, lots of people pick apart that word. What does it mean? Both Jews and non-Jews often say we shouldn't call it anti-Semitism, and other people are Semites and not just Jews, as well as saying, why don't we call it racism or Jew hatred or anti-Jew racism? And I hear all those conversations, but again, it's a bit like the conversation we had about who broke the ceasefire. I almost don't care, because it's obvious what we're talking about, and it's obvious that certain behaviors towards religious minorities are wrong and utterly wrong and should be stopped or fought against or punished when they happen. And I would say that absolutely for people who abuse Muslims, that of course I'm not in favor of that. The issue is whether or not we can criticize religions. And I think that we can criticize religions. And I say that as a Jewish person. People are welcome to criticize Judaism. I engage in lots of conversations which are critical of elements of Judaism or Jewish practice. And I think welcome them. In fact, Judaism as a faith welcomes debate and discussion. It's part of the way the religion has developed over the years. The Talmud is made up of rabbinical discussions and debates. So I think it's a fundamental part of Judaism that we welcome that. I think it's a problem when critiquing or analysing or criticising Islam is forbidden, because that's basically a blasphemy law. And the same way that we wouldn't in this country for one moment hesitate to criticise practices of Christianity or specific Christians, let's say, and the same for Jews, well, then we must also be allowed to do the same for specific Muslims, or, I would say much more importantly, to be openly and outspokenly critical of Islamic organizations or states when they behave in ways which are completely counter to our beliefs. If you think about how many countries in the world are run by Islamic law, and whether we feel that their application of their law and their freedoms are compatible with our ethos, I think it goes without saying that we ought then to be able to criticize them. And if they've based their beliefs and actions on Islam, how is it that we are the people that are at fault if we then critique that because we disagree with it? So I think that it's naturally very, very uncomfortable, especially for Jewish people, to criticize other minority groups, because we have been the victims of so much criticism and persecution throughout our history. And yet I would say that that can't be the reason we don't do it, because where a minority group actually acts in a way that we disagree with for logical and reasonable and ethical reasons, of course we should mention it. It's uncomfortable. That's what I said earlier. It's really uncomfortable. I'm not naturally a person that seeks out argument, contrary to what it might seem in my public manifestations. I just think that when someone is doing something wrong and they themselves tell you it's because of their faith, we can't just say, oh, it's Islamophobic to criticize it. You can't do it. That's the end of the discussion. And as you said, that does not mean I think you should be able to do anything you like to Muslims and hate people for being Muslim. I don't think any of that. But I do think that it's quite clear what the difference is. And I think that the efforts to try to make a law and a definition around Islamophobia, which is deliberately equivalent to the attempt to do that with anti-Semitism, is, in my mind, probably quite a calculated move to try to pull the rug from under the feet of Jews fighting against anti-Semitism, and similarly to put up barriers against people being able to critique Islam in a justifiable way.
Very well put. Your mention of the Talmud there reminded me that I wanted to ask you about the resurgence of anti-Semitic feeling amongst more right-wing people. Because it's something that I've been following for some. I mean, obviously, there's been right-wing anti-Semitism for decades and decades and decades, and arguably that was the form it took in the darkest moment of the 20th century with fascism and so on. But it does seem to have been making a comeback, and both of us are familiar with left-wing anti-Semitism, or the socialism of fools, as it's sometimes called. You've had much experience of it, but you had direct experience during that blow up at Oxford University at the end of last year, I think, where you and some others were speaking against the motion that Israel is an apartheid state. And the scenes in the Oxford Union were extraordinary. I mean, just real hostility. Some of it came from Muslims, I would say some pretty radical Muslims who were in the audience, but some of it also came from those fashionably left-wing, liberal, caring sections of the student body at Oxford who were incredibly hostile to you and the other speakers. But alongside that, we have seen a resurgence of a more right-leaning form of hatred. I mean, from people like Candace Owens and Nick Fuentes and all these, in my view, quite despicable people who spread lies and misinformation online about the Talmud, about Jews, about Israel, and they've become incredibly conspiratorial. What have you made of that and the form that it's taken, I guess, since 7th of October? It's almost as if they try to hide what are sometimes just fascistic tendencies. They try to hide that behind a critique of Israel, which makes me increasingly uncomfortable.
Well, sadly, it's not unique. It's nobody has license over anti-Semitism, not the left, not the right, not Muslims, not non-Muslims. Even some Jews are quite anti-Semitic. So I think that's depressing, but I think most Jews know it. That I gave a speech actually on the 500th day since October the 7th at a vigil. And I normally try to give a bit of optimism in those sorts of things, but I just couldn't. And I said, it's, 500 days of hate. That's what I think the Jewish community around the world, Jews around the world, not even if they're part of a community, felt just like 500 days of utter hate, sparked by one of the worst things to happen to us in living memory. So that seemed doubly weird that there was that hatred. And so, yes, some of that has come from the right. I mean, when you see Kanye West deciding that swastikas are his new thing and to just layer on his anti-Semitism. And the most depressing thing I think about a lot of this right-wing anti-Semitism in the mainstream, people like Candace Owens, is that, I think back, I once quite liked some of the stuff Candace Owens was doing. And I look at her now and I think how weird it is, because I don't think she seems like the same person. She seemed quite intelligent in some of the stuff she used to say. And I'm thinking specifically back to some of the discourse she had around Black Lives Matter and stuff earlier on. And then I thought, well, does that mean I was wrong then? And that I should have seen the same thing that I'm seeing in her anti-Semitism? But I'm not necessarily sure that's true either. I think that part of what's responsible for this is the algorithmic nature of what we all see. So I think that if you want to be wildly popular online, and that's often driven by making money, you need clicks, and clicks are driven by controversy and also by tapping into subcultures or groups. And so I think that if you're on the right naturally, you may manage to bolster your following and your clicks and your interest, and then boost the algorithm because of that by expressing more and more extreme views. So I do think that there's been a kind of push towards the extremes, including anti-Semitism in that regard. But that's not all there is to it. Anti-Semitism, there's that, it's an old joke. Anti-Semitism is hating Jews more than is strictly necessary. And I think that there's always been an element of anti-Semitism in the right, in parts of the right. I think that most Jews have almost internalized and tolerated a certain amount of being treated differently. I went to very English school, and I went to Oxford, and I think I always knew that there were portions of the society I mixed in, probably deep down underneath, thought I was a bit different or not quite the same as them. And in truth, I wasn't quite the same as them. I had a different background and a different upbringing in some respects. I'm not just Jewish. My father was Italian as an immigrant to this country, and I was brought up with Jewish traditions as well as all the British traditions and education that I had. So I think that, I'm talking around it a lot because I don't really know the answer to why there's this resurgence on the far right, other than I think that it was there already. There was a germ of it, and perhaps we tolerated that germ too much. And we said, well, that doesn't matter. It won't get any bigger. And it did. And we concentrated a lot on the left. And so the right had this fertile ground for allowing it to come back. I just think that obviously it's wrong wherever it occurs. And I urge people away from extremism. It's very unsexy to try and advocate for moderation or centre grounds. And I'm not a wishy-washy centrist. I think on some things I'm absolute about truths and freedoms and values. But I just get so depressed when I see younger people, especially, being wooed by online extremism of any sort that is aiming to harness their very human drives in really damaging ways. And I just, I am afraid of the anti-Semitism on the right and on the left. I think I'm probably more afraid of the anti-Semitism on the left right this moment. But as you've rightly pointed out, that to focus too much on one allows the other one to grow.
Okay, Jonathan, my final question for you, I guess, is about what might come next. And just to bring this back to where we started in relation to Israel and the future of the Jewish nation. You talked earlier on about whether Israel can use military pressure, not only to try to get rid of the leaders of Hamas, but also to force Hamas into new negotiations or to put them on the back foot in some way. And there's so much around that issue what would an Israeli victory look like? What impact would it have on the world? What would it mean not only for Israel, but also for the things we've been talking about, these kind of regressive ideologies that are taking hold in our own communities, never mind in the Middle East. So what do you think comes next with Israel? Do you think it's still a noble, realistic goal to eliminate Hamas? Do you think if Israel does that, I hope it does at some point, if Israel does that, will it have a positive effect in the Middle East, possibly in the West as well? How do you see things panning out in the next few months and years?
Nice, easy question to end on. I think there are reasons to be optimistic. And I think in terms of Israel, it's hard to call it optimism when you're understanding of a renewed wave of extreme war. I mean, that's not an optimistic position. Yet, I do think that with the status quo, there are often sets of bad options and no good options. And so Israel, I think, has not had the luxury of this kind of fantasy that everything could be rosy if we just did ABC. I think it's a country that has lived in this state of existential threat for so many years, but over the last couple, it's really begun to understand it. And so I think that Israel's shifted now to a kind of comprehensive long-term strategy to neutralize Hamas's capabilities thoroughly. And if it said that's what it was doing before, I think it might actually be doing it now because it's bolstered by a US administration that is accommodating of that aim, and it's being reinforced by robust American military aid. So I think in real terms, that is perhaps what we're witnessing the beginning of at the moment. And that means an end perhaps to the previous contradictory approach, which is being abandoned. It was abandoned immediately by Donald Trump, and it's been replaced by something a bit more cohesive and strategic. So I think the problem with Biden's support was that he did have some sort of ideological support of Israel and what it was doing, but he was also constantly flip-flopping, withholding weapons or condemning in public things Israel did, saying they mustn't go into Rafah when Israel did and was fairly effective in Rafah. There was a lot of doublespeak and back and forth, which gave the impression that America wasn't squarely behind Israel's aims. I think Trump has certainly dealt with that quite conclusively, both in words and in action, and that maybe has given Israel this license. And in broader terms, in terms of the world and what it means for the rest of us, I really don't know. And that's one of the reasons why it feels so uncertain being alive right now, especially here in London. I think that there's the big changes, rapid changes, extreme ideals. They're all very scary, even if you agree with some elements of them. So there's an awful lot of risk in the world around us at the moment. That means that sometimes high risk pays off and you get massive rewards, but sometimes high risk means you lose everything and everything ends in disaster. And I think that that's really the knife edge that we're all balanced on. I hope that with everything going on around us, more and more people are beginning to understand just what's important, what's less important right now to get hung up on, and to focus on the things that we really need to, globally and domestically. And so I hope that Britain might in turn go through some sort of realignment. I don't see how that's going to happen during this period of Labour government at the moment. They're not being, I think, particularly good in that sense. And that's not a left-right thing on my part. I just don't think they're doing a great job of standing up for a specific outlook or ideology. But who knows, they may yet have to. And similarly, it doesn't mean I'm a massive Trump flag waver on every issue. I think there's something terrifying about some of the ways he does things and some of the things he says. Maybe they're necessary, maybe they'll work, but at times it's absolutely terrifying to watch that as well. So unfortunately, I don't think I can end this one on an optimistic or hopeful note. It doesn't mean I've given up. I certainly haven't. But like you, I think we both focus on a lot of these issues. And that's one of the reasons I love your writing, if I can just say so, is that, and when I see you speak, is that none of this from me looks like you do it out of a position of rosy-eyed romanticism or love for any particular set of people, whether it's Jews, Israel, Brits, the Irish, Donald Trump. We can all have our own emotional reactions to different groups. Sometimes we're part of them. But when you are able to have a clear vision of why you think certain things are right and wrong, not out of emotional kind of gut reactions, that's when I think you start to be able to have a broader view and a broader kind of outlook on how we should try to change things. And so that's what I try to do. And I've always been inspired by watching you do it, because I think you do project that sense of considered analysis. And I hope that kind of example means that other people do the same. And that's the push away from the TikTok, Instagram, algorithmic feeding of our worst bits into the feeding of our best bits. Human beings are incredibly smart, analytical problem solvers, as well as deeply flawed, emotional and reactive beasts. So I think it's all about the powers that be in the future, encouraging the right side and trying to get people to be aware of the other side, and hope that, the cooler minds will prevail and that we can find ways to get through all these problems, whether it's in Israel or in the UK or in Europe or the West more broadly. So I'm in short, feeling very uncertain.
Jonathan, thank you very much.
Thank you.